up in the same city. Our families knew each other. In the Jewish community, we belonged to the same synagogue. And the Hebrew school, the Hebrew school that I went to, his mother was my Hebrew school teacher. His father was the principal of the school. His father was involved in the Hebrew college in Philadelphia. So that was from age 5. We never met, we just always knew each other. But it was during the sort of adolescent years that we became, where there got to be a relationship.
In 1993, there was a list of the top 10 authorities cited in U.S. academic journals of the arts and humanities in the previous 7 years. So this is a list from number 1 to number 10. Number 1, Karl Marx, Lenin, William Shakespeare, Aristotle, the Bible, Plato, Freud, Noam Chomsky, Hegel, Cicero.
I'm a persona that attracts people. The world's in real trouble. I mean, I'm not a. If I had the capacity to be a good speaker, which I don't, I wouldn't use it. I mean, I'm a boring speaker, and I like it that way. And if people want to come and hear me, that's fine. I don't do a song and dance, and I don't have fancy rhetoric. I doubt very much that anybody is attracted by whatever the persona is. People are interested in the issues. And they're interested in the issues because they're important. But the so-called war on terror, there are people who want it to be a war against Muslims. I mean, I'm sure that's Osama bin Laden's fondest dream. If he could turn it into a war against Muslims, he'd have won. Then you get the Muslim world fighting the West, and it'll be a battle to the end of days. And I'm sure ultra-right Christian fundamentalists want the same thing. It's one of the reasons they support the extremist right in Israel. So yeah, there are people who would like that to turn out, but I'm sure that the guys planning it in Washington don't. I mean, that'd be the craziest thing for them to even think about. That's why they tossed North Korea into the axis of evil. Well, what's North Korea got to do with Iran and Iraq? I mean, I got more to do with them. But North Korea is not Muslim, so if you throw that in, it sort of makes it look as it's not a war. And it isn't, I mean, it's pretty obvious. I mean, just say the last assassination in Yemen, which everybody thinks was wonderful. Suppose this was assassination of a person who was suspected of involvement in terrorist acts and 5 other guys who happened to be around. Okay? And that's considered, peaches and cream. Suppose that Cuba assassinated Orlando Bosch, see? I mean, maybe the leading international terrorist in the world. You don't have to suspect him. He's got a long record of terrorist activities, including involvement in blowing up a Cubana airliner, killing 73 people, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And he's happily living in Florida, along with a whole pile of other international terrorists. So suppose Cuba assassinated him, with a missile attack. What do you think would happen? It would have drastic retaliation, which could go all the way. Nobody knows what's going to happen once you start a war. Just take a look at history. Anybody who tried to predict was usually wildly wrong. It's just too many things can happen. But we know what is intended. So, for example, people right near the center of power, like Richard Pearl and Rumsfeld and the rest of them, they've described their long-term intentions. Actually, Pearl and others were writing position papers 6 years ago for Benjamin Netanyahu. That's the ultra-right in Israel, to the right of Sharon. And these papers, they're not detailed, but they describe a vision for the Middle East, which is basically like the Ottoman Empire. Centers of power in Jerusalem and Ankara, of course, as part of the U.S. global system, and the rest of the region kind of given local regional autonomy. I mean, one idea they talk about is extending the Jordanian Hashemite kingdom to parts of Iraq and parts of Saudi Arabia. In this framework, we'd offer an opportunity for driving out the Palestinians and solving that problem, and then reorganizing the whole region. I mean, there's crazy ideas. These ideas actually are scaring the hawks, the hardline hawks, who are warning, not to pay attention to the what they call the sillier armchair strategists, who unfortunately happen to be right near the center of power. So they got long-term objectives, in fact, reaching all the way to China. But what'll happen? I mean, nobody can guess. I mean, we know what the CIA predicts. What they predict is a large increase in terrorism. They say right now, in fact, and other world intelligence agencies say exactly the same thing, and it's kind of obvious. You don't need the CIA to tell you. I mean, if you attack Iraq, first of all, you're going to spawn a new generation of people who want revenge. It's almost predictable, and it's very likely. I mean, if you're Saddam Hussein, there's only one deterrent, and that's terror attacks. So, very likely. It wouldn't be surprising if there's somebody in New York has already assembled the parts of a nuclear bomb, sneaking it across the Canadian border, which is pretty porous, and it's just waiting for the signal. I mean, that's the kind of thing intelligence agencies have been worrying about for years, way before September 11th, and are expecting now as the consequence of an attack. I mean, maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. They don't know. Intelligence agencies aren't that, don't know that much, but it's a plausible expectation. Notice that the threats to our interest at that time could also not be laid at Iraq's door. This is March 1990. At that time, Saddam Hussein was a favored friend and trading partner of the U.S. and the UK, Thatcher, Reagan, Bush, and the rest. In fact, all the people who are now running the show in Washington, they thought he was a fine guy. That was a position that he retained for another few months until August 1990, when he committed the first crime that really mattered, namely disobeying orders. At that point, he lost the status of moderate, which had been unaffected by such acts as gassing Kurds and torturing dissidents and using chemical weapons, and in fact everything else that he's now being correctly charged for that never mattered at all. And the U.S. and Britain continued to not only support him, but provide him with the means to develop weapons of mass destruction. That continued right up till the first disobedience. These are all, again, facts it wouldn't do to mention in these grim days right now, especially when Tony Blair and George Bush and everyone else is talking about how we can't let this monster survive after he committed all these crimes, which they then enumerate, all accurately, but always missing a few words, like with our help, because we didn't care, and therefore we continued to provide him with weapons of mass destruction after them. That's invariably missing, as you can see. But it was there, and there were also reasons. The reasons were very straightforward. So as the State Department explained in early 1990, the reason is that our duty to support U.S. exporters. That's when they were overriding cabinet objections and congressional objections in continuing support for their friend Saddam, who was fulfilling his function properly, and continuing to help him develop weapons of mass destruction. George Bush the first was authorizing support for him up to the day before the invasion of Kuwait. The British were a little slower on the draw, and they continued doing it a couple of days later before they managed to realign their priorities. But Saddam Hussein's crimes had absolutely nothing to do with it. All of his worst crimes were behind him at that point. In fact, it's interesting, the people who recognize this are conservatives. So, for example, in Foreign Affairs, which is, the most respectable establishment journal you can think of, a couple of right-wing military analysts, John and Robert Miller, I think their name, a couple of years ago, pointed out that the number of people killed by the sanctions in Iraq is greater than the total number of people killed by all weapons of mass destruction in all of history. But notice we're doing it to them, so it's therefore not a crime or a problem. If they did it to us, of course, something else. It's an ongoing war. It's had a devastating effect on the population. I mean, there's no reputable authority who doubts that the number of children killed by them is less than in the hundreds of thousands. I mean, you can argue about the numbers, but and well, you've seen the consequences. I mean, Iraq was on the verge of becoming a first world society. Now it's a very poor, devastated third world society. And if the war is, as you put it correctly, escalated sharply, it could push them off the edge.
He's in a class on his own as far as contemporary intellectuals are concerned. He has, on the one hand, this huge track record in linguistics as one of the most important linguists who've ever lived. In addition to that, he's had this lifelong commitment to political activism. Putting the two things together really does put him in a class on his own. He has a very important message to put out, one that's not often heard. He's extraordinarily well informed. I mean, he seems to, so far as one can tell, he's read everything and remembered what he's read as well, which is, it's just astonishing to talk to him.
It's funny how hard it is. It takes so much background. I mean, the amount of time that is spent acquiring the background is, I mean, it's a very specific kind of life in which that's what he does. He reads, 6 newspapers a day and 80 journals altogether, I think. And this is sort of half of his professional life, in a way. It's not really his professional life. I mean, it's, and so it's his second career.
First of all, their pressure on the national media has an effect. I mean, look, even in totalitarian states, they respond to pressure, certainly in more democratic societies. So there are pressures on the media have an effect. Furthermore, the media are in many ways more open and free than they were 40 years ago because they reflect the general raising of the level of civilization. I mean, a lot of people in the media are people who came through the experiences of the 60s and 70s and 80s, and they're just different than they were 40 years ago. So you don't get the kind of, unquestioning loyalty. I mean, if an American president today tried to do what Kennedy did in 1962, there'd be an uproar in the media, not just in the public. And besides, there's now alternatives, like one of the earlier questioners mentioned, that the internet is a major alternative. New technology, which wasn't developed for that purpose, but it's there, is giving all sorts of options for alternative ways of communicating. For one thing, printing is just a lot cheaper than it ever was. It's desktop publishing is now very feasible. You don't have to have a big printing establishment, and the electronic communications there are all kinds of ways, and organizations that develop, they develop their own intercommunication and interaction and media, and that's the way things happen. So there's plenty of opportunities.
I remember the criticisms that American media were making of the Russian invasion of Afghanistan at the time. And Chomsky turned around and said, it's all well and good for American journalists to criticize Russians in Afghanistan. The audience for them, who's going to hear that, isn't going to be able to do much to help the Afghans. And you can sound very pious about it, but the real test of protest is who your audience is. And are you addressing an audience that can do something to improve the situation? If you're addressing Americans about what Russians are doing in Afghanistan, that's kind of cowardly, is what he said. Really, American media should be addressing American public and American leaders about what they're doing around the world and supporting the Indonesians in East Timor or supporting death squads in El Salvador. That kind of stuff is courageous. But criticizing Russians, that's for the Russian media to do, and because they can actually have an impact on the Russian public and Russian politicians.
I mean, the period when the press was most free was about the mid-19th century. I mean, at that time, just keeping to say England and the United States, the two cases that have been studied, I imagine it's the same elsewhere. In the mid-19th century, there was a very lively, popular press, very widely read by working people, by everyone. That, much reached far beyond the commercial media at the time. It was very diverse. It represented, it reflected public interests and public concerns, and was very popular. In Britain, they tried to close it down by censorship of various kinds, but that didn't work. There were too many ways to avoid it, and it was finally understood that the way to eliminate it was by advertising, by reliance on advertising and by concentration of capital. So just through the effect of reliance on advertising, which was then just a kind of beginning, like around a century ago, and concentration of capital, they realized that over time they could marginalize the independent popular press, which couldn't get the advertising, of course, because advertisers don't like what they were saying, and didn't have the capital. And it took a long time. So in England, it was actually up until about 40 years ago, still the case 40 years ago, that the main newspaper in England, the Daily Herald, was a kind of labor-oriented, social democratic newspaper, very popular. Everybody had outsold all the others. The Mirror, which was the main tabloid, was the same, kind of leftist paper, popular paper. But they kind of succumbed to advertising pressure and capital control. The United States happened a bit earlier, but it was the same process. And advertising is, it's part of a much bigger industry. Advertising is part of the public relations industry, which is a huge industry. And it developed very consciously around the First World War in the two most democratic countries, England and the United States. And there's a good reason for it. They were coming to as the countries were becoming more free, that just through popular struggle, and people were winning the franchise, and you couldn't shut them up anymore by force, it was understood that you're going to have to control people by controlling opinion and attitudes, because we can't rely on force anymore. And control of opinion and attitudes means, there was actually a phrase for it. This was the time when what was called scientific management of work was becoming a big issue, Taylorite management, Ford and all that stuff. But it was also understood you want to not only control very closely the lives of people in their work time, but also you have to control them in their off-work time. And what you have to do is turn them into passive, obedient consumers who don't try to get out of our hair, basically. Pay attention to what were called the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption. You get them trapped into consumerism, isolated from one another, atomized, control their beliefs. That's where notions like manufacture of consent come from right after this First World War. And out of this came huge industries. And advertising is a large part of it, and it, of course, affects the media enormously. I mean, if any of you are, if you watch television, for example, take, say, television. When you turn on the television set, the corporation doesn't make any money, right? Like you don't pay them when you turn it on, unless it's cable. But they do. So why do they do it? Well, they do it because of the advertising. So the resources and the creativity and the effort and so on in the whole television industry goes into advertising. In fact, within the television industry, there are words called content and fill. Like a program has content and a program has fill. The content is the advertising. The fill is the car chase that's in there to keep you watching until the next ad comes along. And all the effort, of course, goes into the advertising. And the fill has first of all, it's to keep your interest enough so you watch the advertising, but the advertising is there for a purpose. I mean, it's to turn people into creatures whose only concern in life is to max out their 5 credit cards and not to pay attention to what's going on in the world and let the rich, powerful guys do what they want without interference. So I'm on mainstream television all the time, in Ireland, England, Italy, New Zealand. I mean, there's television. In fact, the public television studios in Boston, all the staff knows me very well. I'm there all the time for satellite broadcasts to even used to be Canada too. That's now declined, and occasionally in the United States. I mean, commercial television is much less constrained than public television. Public television is more liberal, and it's therefore much more ideological and imposes much narrower constraints. They don't allow deviance. That's pretty constant. Yeah, they don't want, I mean, not in their interest to have people talk about things like this. Sometimes they're pressured, and they'll allow a couple of minutes here and there. And it's kind of interesting the way it works. So the television's mostly out, except for commercial cable television. But radio is a little freer. National Public Radio is considered the the kind of outer limits of the left in the United States. Very small, but it's considered very dissident. And they're the ones with the sharpest restrictions by far. I mean, they won't allow a millimeter of deviation from the party line. But sometimes they're under pressure to do it. And it's interesting the way it works. So, for example, during the first Gulf War, I'm pretty well known around Boston, and that happens to be the center, the ideological center for National Public Radio. It's their flagship station and all that sort of thing. And there's a lot of pressure there to let me be on now and then. So during the first Gulf War, they did approach me, and they told me I would be allowed to have 2.5 minutes. However, they insisted that I write out what I was going to say, send it to the central office so they could ensure that it's, okay. And once they approved it, I had to read it. And they pre-recorded it to make sure that I wouldn't add a phrase that wasn't, that went off the limits. The first time, I thought it's kind of ridiculous, but and so did the staff. The staff's mostly laughing, the engineers and so on. But I did read it, and the first reading took 2 minutes and 36 seconds. So they told me, no, I got to reread it. So I read it a little faster, got it into 2 minutes and 30 seconds, and then they actually did run it. And there are other things like that. I'll just mention one other case. Same National Public Radio again, the kind of left medium. They have a book review thing. And again, they're under a lot of pressure often to have something about books of mine. Around 10 years ago, there was a book of mine that was based on lectures over CBC. And it was actually a bestseller in Canada for years, but nobody ever heard of it in the United States. It was never reviewed or anything. But there was pressure around Boston to get them to review that book. Okay, so they finally agreed, and we again had a pre-recorded 5-minute interview with Robert Siegel, who's their big shot intellectual, and it was actually announced. Their main program, called All Things Considered, starts at 5 o'clock, and then every educated person is supposed to listen to it. And at 5 o'clock, they announced that they were going to have a review of this book. The publishers, South End Press, called me up and said, great, it's going to be on. It got to 5:30. It got to 5:25. At 5:25, the program stopped, and there were 5 minutes of music. At 5:30, when they move into the next segment, they announced the next segment, and phone calls started coming in from all over the place, saying, what happened to that 5-minute review? And people, I wasn't listening, but people started calling me and saying, what happened to the review? So after about 10 minutes, I got a call from the manager of the whole thing in Washington, who said, something very strange. We're getting a lot of calls saying that your review didn't appear, but we know that it did. I see it right on my program here. So I said, I don't know anything about it. About 10 minutes later, she called me back, very chagrined, and she said that she was overruled for the first time ever by some higher-up who heard the announcement in the first 5 minutes and canceled it. Well, that caused quite a furor. She was very upset, for professional reasons. Didn't want to be overruled. And there was a lot of public reaction. So they finally agreed to redo another 5 minutes, pre-recorded, and that was the second one they actually ran. Well, that's off at the left liberal end of the spectrum. When you move to the more conservative commercial media, they're less constrained.
There are some extremely violent right-wing groups that, for whom he is absolute anathema. I mean, they're virtually the devil incarnate, and these are groups that in the past have not hesitated to use violence or even assassination to make their case. Most of the strongest hostility at the moment seems to be coming from Zionist groups, as far as we could observe. There was a Cambodian group that put up posters denouncing him for what they claimed was denying that there was ever a massacre in Cambodia in the 1970s, which in fact he never has done, though he's disputed details of the official story that came out at that time. And that, I think, is, so far as I can see, that's not doesn't seem to be a terribly dangerous group, but I thought some of the Zionist groups might be.
Every charismatic leader seems to have ultimately been found to have feet or at least 1 foot of clay. It's something that's hard to live up to. If you're lucky, you'll die before all the books are written. But if you're not, you'll have to put up with a lot. And certainly, a lot of people are afraid to get into public life because they will be attacked personally at every level, as Chomsky has been. But I think if the American right saw him to be that leader, his life might well be in danger. Certainly lives have been lost under suspicious circumstances. And I'd be willing to go as far as to say that as long as he's talking, he's being effective. But if he puts himself in a position where they see him as a danger, then he may in fact be in some kind of physical danger. I honestly believe that.
He is an extremely controversial figure, and his his message about American foreign policy is completely uncompromising, so I think he expects the hostility. He doesn't expect everyone to just accept this and think that it's an obvious truth. I mean, there's a huge propaganda industry seeking to ignore it or to put a different point of view out.
Guys who are now in office, recycled Reaganites mostly, they understand that very well. That's the way they kept the country under control in the 80s, by one or another. The Libyans are coming, the Sandinistas are coming, on, and it frightened people, and people are genuinely frightened. So when George Bush says if we don't stop him today, he's going to come after us tomorrow with weapons of mass destruction, it scares people. I mean, very honest, serious people stand up at meetings and very heartfelt comments saying, yeah, I'm anti-war and I don't like this, but he's going to come after us and there'll be a mushroom cloud. And in fact, if you look around the world, you'll notice that the only people afraid of Saddam Hussein are people from the United States. People in the region aren't afraid of him. Europeans aren't afraid of him. I don't know about Canada. I don't follow that closely. But in the United States, there's real fear. And that's the way you control people. If you want to divert the attention of the population from an assault that you're carrying out against them, frighten them. I mean, it's an old story. And it's used by, it's second nature to everybody. And yes, in fact, they're these are guys who are mostly from the Reagan administration, and they did exactly the same thing then. So 20 years ago, they came in, Reagan administration did it. They're following the same script. First, drive the country into a deep deficit from a budget surplus, the government from surplus to deficit. That means you have to you have to cut back social spending, which is very important. It was done by actually it's described in the Wall Street Journal front page this morning. I mean, they don't put it quite in the terms that I'm going to use, but they basically describe it. They point out that the Bush administration, of course, drove the country into a big deficit by things are happening independently, but their own decisions were two. One was a tax cut, which in fact is for the rich. The Wall Street Journal don't say that. So 40% of it is top 1% of the population. So big tax cut for the rich, and the biggest increase in the in federal government spending for 20 years. That is since the Reagan administration, because these guys are believers in big government. They're not conservatives. They're reactionary, statist extremists. They want a very big government, but for the rich. So the biggest federal spending in 20 years, and a big tax cut for the rich. So of course you get a deficit, and then you can cap, social spending, and you can move on to eliminating the public education system and the limited medical support system that exists in the United States. You've got to get rid of that, cut back pensions and so on. But you don't want people to think about this. What you want is for them to be terrified. So 20 years ago, in fact, just 20 years ago, another bold cowboy was in the White House, surrounded by tanks, because there were hitmen, Libyan hitmen, roaming the streets of Washington. We're going to assassinate our leader. And everybody was trembling in fear and admiring the courage of the John Wayne up there. And it went on like that right through the 1980s. The Sandinistas were 2 days' march from Texas, and Gaddafi was going to expel us from the world, and Hispanic narco-traffickers are going to destroy our youth, and so on and so forth. And the population was terrified. You could carry out the assault. So they're doing the same thing. Same script. So that's where Iraq comes in. Yeah, and you got to have another monster who's going to. In fact, you read George Bush. If we don't get to him now, he's going to be dropping nuclear bombs on us tomorrow. Not like a year from now, but tomorrow. It's going to attack us right away, and people are afraid. I give talks to. I haven't seen an audience of less than a couple of thousand people for quite a while, but when people ask questions, some of them are. It's very genuine. They're genuinely afraid. They say, look, if we don't stop him now, he's going to come after us. And if it isn't him, it's going to be Noriega or, some other monster Gaddafi or whoever comes along. Next, it's going to be Iran. If we don't stop him now, they're going to come after us. And that's the way you frighten people.
I want to ask you about the mobilization of fear, and you talked a lot about it as mobilization of fear of those from without. But one of the things that I guess I would ask you is the way in which mobilization of fear from within can be actually damaging to organizing in terms of fear of one's neighbor, fear of the people who live in your community, and there's ways in which Canada too has been caught in that mobilization, so it's not just fear of being invaded by Saddam Hussein, which in some ways is easier to address than it is to be immobilized by fear that the person you knew is somehow, and it strikes me that that's an element of fear that I'd be interested in you commenting on and what impact that's had in America, because I think that's something which at least I'm very conscious of in reading the news on an ongoing basis, and it strikes me as very much a parallel.
Fear of your actual neighbor, or fear of the guy down in the slums downtown?
No, but also the sense that it's the people who came in through Canada and they were living in our community as normal.
So anti-immigrant fear and that sort of thing.
Exactly, and therefore, in some ways, very similar to what happened in the 1950s. So the 1950s ended up being not, in fact, a time of great organizing, but in fact a time of enormous repression, because everybody ended up turning on one another out of fear of one another.
No, I see. I don't think there was that much repression in the 50s. I think it was internalized. I mean, if the actual repression associated with, say, McCarthyism, it was not very much. I mean, the people who didn't want to submit to it, I remember very well, just laughed at it. I mean, in fact, at the time of the Army McCarthy hearings, I was a grad student at Harvard, and living at home. So they had one television set on campus for out-of-campus students, and a couple of friends of mine and I would go over in the afternoon. and watched the hearings, and we were all cheering for McCarthy. For good reasons. He was being shafted because, although he was a gangster, he ran up against bigger gangsters who were going to destroy him, namely the army. He was fine as long as he was attacking weak people. But as soon as he went after the army, he just got crushed. So we were cheering for Joe, and nothing happened to you. You could do whatever you wanted. There was almost no repression. It was powerful because people accepted it. In the 1960s, they tried to redo it, and people just laughed at them, and it collapsed. The House Un-American Activities Committee was still around, and they got people to come and testify, and they just laughed at them. And so it disappeared because they didn't have any force behind them. So yes, there's a lot. That's internal repression. When you accept repression when it barely exists, instead of standing up against it, in which case it can collapse. But fear of the person down the road or something, that's common. So take, say, the neighborhood where I live in near Boston. It's a kind of a professional, upper middle class suburb with a lot of professors and doctors and that kind of thing. When you at night, every couple of nights, 3 o'clock in the morning, some horrible alarm goes off, waking up everybody in the neighborhood. Turns out everybody's got an alarm except us. Everyone has an alarm system, and they go off randomly, and they're all linked to the police station, which doesn't ever answer them because they assume they're false alarms, which they always are. But or if it's not an alarm in a house, it's on a car or something. It's the same thing. So, and it's because people are scared. Well, what are they scared of? I mean, the greatest threat in this town is maybe a cat will be lost or something like that. But people are scared, so they have to have alarms and this, that, and the other thing. And yes, they're afraid, and that's fostered. But it's part of something much broader, I think. It's part of the effort to break down solidarity and sympathy. And that shows up in all kinds of ways. Like take privatizing schools. What's the point of privatizing schools? Well, the idea is to instill in people the idea that all you care about is yourself. So I don't happen to have children of school age, so therefore, according to the ideology that's implanted in you, I'm not supposed to care whether the kid down the street has a school to go to. So I don't want to pay taxes. I want to cut taxes because I don't care if that kid goes to school. And if, since I have enough money, I could send my kid to private school if I wanted to, so who cares if they're public schools? So we should privatize schools to eliminate the conception that we should care if some other kid goes to school, which everybody has. So you got to drive it out of their heads. The same is true, I don't know if it's happening here, of efforts to privatize pension and security systems. What's the point of that? Like in the U.S., these big effort to try to privatize Social Security. I mean, financially speaking, it's ridiculous. It's a huge cost and everything else. But there are reasons for it. Social Security is based on an unacceptable principle, namely that that you should care if the disabled widow across town survives. And you're not supposed to care about that. You're supposed to care about whether you have enough pairs of shoes and stuff like that, and, enough cars and video games or whatever it is. That's all you're supposed to care about. So you got to privatize Social Security. Also, another advantage to privatizing Social Security is that it has the brilliant consequence of turning working people against their own interests. Because if your pension is tied up in stocks, you want to make sure those stocks go up. And the way those stocks go up is by cutting wages and reducing working conditions and, sending jobs to, Chinese sweatshops and so on. So as a working person, you have to be committed to undermining your own interests. And that's important. So for reasons like that, you want to privatize Social Security and privatize water and schools and everything else, and also make people afraid of each other. So you should be afraid of the people next door, so you should pour your money into alarm systems that the police aren't paying any attention to. It's all idiotic, and so on and so forth. Yeah, these are ways of controlling people. And fear is one of them. That's why fear of crime is so high in the United States. It's not because of crime. It's because it's manufactured.
And when you see the activist groups, you know, and they say, what can we do? I mean, all that you've described is so discouraging. What can we do? And he, you know, I mean, I think, if I can use the word inspiring, I mean, he says exactly what you're doing. You've got to keep things active, essentially lead an activist life.
So the global justice movements, which wanted to take a different form, they are a completely new phenomenon. Never been anything like them. It started in the South. So the main centers are India and Brazil and places like that. And 10 or 15 years later, it reached the North. So, you know, when it got to the streets of Seattle, you had to start paying attention to it. As long as it's just a couple 100,000 Indian peasants demonstrating at Parliament, you know, who cares about that? But so and it's now international. So at Porto Alegre in the World Social Forum meetings, I was down there last February. There's people from all over, the 70,000 people or so, all over the world, every possible walk of life, every interest and concern you can imagine. Very lively, energetic, interesting, and they reflect activism all over the world, you know, from campesinos to environmentalists to anything you can think of. And that's an entirely new phenomenon. You know, it's sort of, in a sense, you could imagine it's the beginnings of the realization of what was the main goal of the workers' movements and the left 150 years ago, namely a genuine international. There's never been one, and the seeds of them were quickly destroyed. But this is really taking off, and it is a reflection of things happening everywhere.
If I look back on the life of activism of most of my friends who are activists, the key thing that people got from going out to coffee shops and talking to Chomsky and listening to him and getting a chance to have one-on-one conversations or a few people getting together was that he sort of, you know, the foundation of how to approach an issue, the building blocks of how to think about something. Chomsky really gave those to us.
The country's just become a lot more civilized, and so has a good deal of the West, and it wasn't given as a gift. I mean, any more than civil rights were or anything else, or labor rights or anything you can think of. These are the results of constant struggle. And the options are perfectly well open to us, much more open to us than to most people in the world. I mean, we've got an enormous amount of freedom thanks to the achievements of our predecessors who struggled to win that freedom. And now we have it, and that gives us opportunities that most people in the world just don't have. You know, like you try to speak up for freedom of speech in Turkey, as many people courageously do, you can end up in a Turkish prison, which isn't a lot of fun. You try to do it in one of the U.S. client states in Latin America, you can get your brains blown out. In Colombia, for example. We don't have those problems. So for us to talk, there's no problem in carrying out activities, and we've got plenty of opportunities. It's succeeded in the past. There's no reason why it shouldn't continue to. So I don't see any problem there. In fact, I think it's the best period for organizing and activism that I can remember, at least in my lifetime.
How do you talk to people without alienating them and still encouraging people to address power dynamics without making it too theoretical?
Well, don't you think that these things are just normal aspects of everybody's life, which can be described in their own terms? I mean, after all, we're not, as far as I know, we're not bringing up any particularly sophisticated concepts that you can't talk about to children. Yeah. Well, does the average person not understand things about, sexual abuse or, bosses giving orders that you don't like, and, all the destroying the environment? I mean, I think these are things that are everybody's concerns. If they're not, it's because they're just not, they don't have the time or energy or whatever to think about them. Well, those of you who are organizers should speak up. I mean, do you really, do you teach people or do you learn from them? Part of being on the left at that time was bringing what we call high culture, science, mathematics, the arts, and so on, to people who didn't have the advantages of the privileges of going through school. Going through school then meant even maybe getting to 4th grade. And it could certainly be done. It ends up, people want it, they like it, they participate in it, they go on by themselves. And those of us, all of us who are privileged, one of the responsibilities is to help people do this for themselves.
How do we get people to liberate themselves? How do we get people to collectively organize? How do we liberate people from racism and sexism? It starts, it's a cliche to say it starts inside you, but it's just like when you start thinking in terms of that, in terms of other people and what they need, that's when you get into the realm of theorizing about ideal communities and societies, and not asking, well, why am I asking this question now? What was the discussion previous to this? What's my role as a class, middle class, upper class, whatever, gender, sexual orientation, whatever. And I think that's a really easy trap for university-oriented activists to fall into. What's the ideal solution for everyone? What's the utopia? And how you get people to understand our vision and go there. Well, why aren't we going to places? Instead of saying, why aren't people here? Let's bring them in here. Let's use our privilege to extend us to everybody. Teach the world. That's colonialism. It's why don't we just...
Well, is it colonialism if, let's say, I suppose I know mathematics and I go into a working class area and help people learn mathematics? Is that colonialism?
Okay, now that's a loaded question, right?
No, I don't think so. That's what workers' education is.
Now, I'm not painting
I've got a
workers' education with the brush of colonialism.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that for you to do that without interrogating your privilege, right?
I'm abandoning it, but I'm saying I'm going to use it. Look, I'm not denying that I have it. I'm not going to pretend that I'm a poor Korean immigrant who can't speak English. I'm not. Nor am I going to pretend that I can work in a rape crisis center. I can't. I'm myself. I'm not some other person. And the question is whether being who you are, whoever you are, without denying that that's who you are, you can do something useful for other people. I'm sure we're not disagreeing. We can't deny who we are. I'm not going to go organize steel workers because I just can't. In order to do it, I have to become a steel worker, and then I got to undo my whole background and start over from age 1. And I'm not going to do that, and there wouldn't be any point in my doing it.
I appreciated his citing how much progress we've made in individual rights and freedoms in the last 40 years. It's good to be reminded of that, and because we get so bogged down. I get so bogged down. It's great to hear him push for a more popular struggle and know that, it does make a difference.
There's a reason why we're much more free, and there's a lot more justice now than there was in the past. There's a reason why human rights are much better protected. Actually, there's a reason why the Wilsonian intellectuals had to turn to propaganda as a technique of manipulation and control because force wasn't available any longer. The reason is popular struggles over many years, which have just improved things enormously, just as they have in the last few years. Trilateral Commission intellectuals were worried about the ferment of the 60s and the excess of democracy. There's been many attempts to try to figure out how to crush it and to restore the indoctrination of the young, but they haven't worked. There's been much more activism and engagement and, in fact, progress in many dimensions in the last 20 or 30 years. So, for example, if you go back to the 1960s, just remember what things were like. There was barely any feminist movement. Women's rights sort of an issue way out at the margins. There was no environmental movement. Nobody cared about protecting an environment. There were no third world solidarity movements. There was no anti-nuclear movement. There was no global justice movement, these massive movements which really are very significant. There was no opposition to aggression. It was considered just fine. So the protests now over the coming war in Iraq are absolutely unique. They have no historical precedent, at least that I can think of. I can't think of another case in the entire history of European imperialism when there were protests before a war was started.
It's in the last year. It's since September 11th. And he comments on that himself. I mean, it's the interviews, the requests for speaking, it's just inundated. And it's almost as if, I mean, this is my own take on it, that the desire of people to sort of hear another position in order to come to understand everything that's going on or that has happened it's just people are hungering for hearing an analysis, another analysis than the one they usually get.
You look through hundreds of years of history, the West has a virtual monopoly of violence. So massive terror is the kind of thing we do to them. You know, they're not supposed to do it to us. September 11th was the first break. It's the first time in hundreds of years that any Western country has suffered on home soil the kind of thing they do routinely everywhere else. You know. And in Israel, it's sort of the same. Actually, it was pretty striking for me to see this. I mean, after September 11th, I had a ton of interviews everywhere, except the United States, of course. And often it was national radio and TV. And often a couple of times it turned out to be Irish and television and BBC back to back. And the difference in reaction was startling, you know. I mean, things that if I said this much on Irish TV, okay, discussion over, everyone understands what I'm talking about. Try to say it on BBC, you have to go on for like about an hour to explain to them what you mean. The Irish Sea is a chasm, you know, and it just depends who's been holding the whip for 800 years and who's been under it for 800 years. And the same is true everywhere else in the world, you know. But for the West, the idea that anybody should do to us a fraction of what we regularly do to them is just outrageous, you know. And the same is true in Israel. It's a 35-year occupation. I mean, up until very recently, they were literally immune from retaliation from within the territories. And they weren't acting very nicely there. It was brutal, you know, humiliating, repressive, robbing the resources, kicking the people out, and so on. But there was no retaliation. Okay, last year or two, there's some retaliation. So it's, you know, scandalous. It's also considered a scandal in the West, right? Because we do it to them, it's okay, but they do it to us, it's not okay. You know, so if Israel invades Lebanon with U.S. backing and kills 20,000 people, well, you know, it's the way the cookie crumbles. It's not a problem. But if it goes the other direction, a couple people get killed, yeah, that's a horror story. Well, the question that I was asked is, what was the effect of 9/11 on organizing? And seems to me it was kind of a dual effect. September 11th, it was immediately predicted, and now we can look back and see that the prediction was correct, that every repressive force in the world would take it as a window of opportunity to extend what they were doing. So, for example, the Russians took it as an opportunity to extend the attack in Chechnya, pretending that it's a war on terror, and now with the authorization of Washington. The Chinese did the same in Western China. Indonesia did the same in Aceh, Israel and the occupied territories, and so on down the list. Furthermore, just about every government used it as an opportunity to try to impose greater discipline on their own populations, under, again, the pretext of a war on terror. So that's true of the more dictatorial states, like, say, Central Asia. It's also true of the more democratic societies with prevention of terrorism ordinances and other devices of one sort or another, mainly to try to discipline their own populations. These are just continuations of tendencies that are already in process, using this kind of opportunity to escalate it. And that was predictable, and of course it's happened. If you're interested in terror, you should look at its causes. Now, if for the point of view of apologists for state violence, like the ones you're mentioning, you're not allowed to look at the causes because that's considered rationalization or justification. So if you try to look for the causes, like every sane person does, that's rationalization. What you're supposed to do is have tantrums and scream about Islamic fascism and blame it on the bad genes of the Arabs or something. But you're not allowed to look at the causes, and there's a good reason for that. As soon as you look at the causes, you start looking in the mirror. And that you have to block. You know, the main task of intellectuals, always, but now too, is to make sure that people never look in the mirror. We never look at ourselves. They only look at other people.
The heckling, the leafleting at the door, there's, well, as you can imagine, there's an enormous amount of hostility. And the different groups will interrupt in the question-answer period, and, you know, oh yeah, there's a lot of, that shows up often.
In fact, one useful effect of the end of the Cold War is the clouds have lifted somewhat, and reality is coming into clearer view, and it takes a little more effort to suppress what should have been obvious all along. Well, 5 years after this came the review of post-Cold War deterrence that I was quoting earlier, and now the meaning of deterrence is clarified. You have to deter those who seek an independent path. And it's only by suffering really deep historical amnesia of the kind that Orwell attributed to a properly functioning educational system. It's only by that you can fail to recognize the pedigree of this doctrine, which goes back to the end of World War II, and there are plenty of precedents earlier in the history of other imperial states. Perhaps the most instructive illustration of all of this is Cuba. It's an example which happens to be highly relevant and very timely right now. Recall we've just passed the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The anniversary was the occasion for a high-level conference in Havana of Russians, Cubans, and Americans, mostly from the Kennedy administration, and it yielded some startling information about how close the world came to a nuclear war that would have given the unwanted answer to Ernst Mayer's question. It was discovered that we were saved from perhaps terminal catastrophe by a word, a single word, from a Russian submarine captain named Vasily Arkhipov, who ought to get hundreds of Nobel Peace Prizes. He countermanded an order to fire nuclear-armed missiles from a submarine that was then under bombardment by U.S. destroyers who were enforcing John F. Kennedy's naval quarantine. That's how close we came to the end of human civilization. Okay, one word from a Russian submarine captain. That was the most dangerous moment in human history. Historian Arthur Schlesinger commented, who's Kennedy's advisor at the time, when he heard about this. Robert McNamara, who was then Secretary of Defense, he observed at the conference, as he had before, that Cuba was justified in fearing a U.S. invasion. He said, if I had been in Cuban or Russian shoes, I would have thought so too. Those facts in no way mitigate the criminal lunacy of sending nuclear-armed missiles as a deterrent, or the other interactions of that very grim month in which we almost got the answer to the question whether it's better to be smart than stupid, the wrong answer. Well, these extraordinary facts were very marginally reported in the United States. I don't know how they were dealt with here. They elicited virtually no comment. The press did, however, report that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba is no longer promoting terrorism as it did before. That follows the convention of the scholarly literature on terrorism, which highlights allegations of a Cuban role in terrorism, but manages somehow to ignore the fact that Cuba probably holds the world record as a target of terrorism for the last 40 years. It's another fact it wouldn't do to mention. That includes the terrorist acts of the top-level commanders in Washington that aroused the fear of another invasion and helped precipitate the missile crisis, and came very close to destroying what we call human civilization. So it takes really impressive discipline for educated sectors not to mention these particular facts, again, Orwell's phrase, just at the moment when the awesome consequences that have been so narrowly averted have just been revealed. I looked and I could find no mention. Maybe you had lead editorials in the Globe and Mail about it and scholarly articles, but I didn't see any mention.
But for an academic to take those risks, to say the heck with my career and the heck with disciplinary boundaries and the heck with being liked by everybody and getting good reviews and being praised by my peers, I'm really just going to say what I think is true and dedicate my life to that. It's very sad to say that there's only a tiny minority of academics in universities that do that. And we begin to realize what a crime that is when we see that these are the people who have access to facts, who have the training to interpret them and make sense of them, who have privilege, in our country at least, to communicate those facts to others, and instead they frequently concentrate on advancing their careers, perhaps I should say we, on advancing our careers, on speaking in arcane language that ordinary people can't understand, on erecting disciplinary fences so that nobody who wasn't trained in our discipline is allowed in. And he has no time for that. He has contempt for disciplinary boundaries. If he wants to learn economics, he studies it. If he wants to talk about history, he studies it. So we have somebody who is an intellectual and an academic, committing his life to justice, using all his intellectual resources, and not caring about disciplinary boundaries. When you put it all together, it's quite an unusual mix.
Before 1968, there isn't a hint that Kennedy was trying to get out of Vietnam, because he wasn't. He was one of those extreme hawks in the administration. The declassified record shows that very clearly. After 1968, all these guys rewrote the stories. And it turns out that Kennedy was struggling to get out of Vietnam, and he thought the war was awful, and and then this bad Texan came in after him and escalated it. It's total nonsense. And you can see it when you compare what they were doing beforehand. Like Arthur Schlesinger wrote a day-by-day account of the 1,000 days. Not a hint there that anybody was even thinking of getting out of Vietnam. The issue never even came up. Afterwards, Kennedy was a real dove, wanted to end the war and so on. And then by now there's a whole industry of people, mostly on the left incidentally, trying to prove that Kennedy was trying to get out of Vietnam and that's why he was assassinated and so on and so forth. Kind of the Oliver Stone type business. It's totally false, And but that's the picture that intellectuals construct of themselves post hoc. And since they're the only one, they're kind of like the custodians of history, it ends up that way. That's still be in the textbooks and the history books and so on. You want to find out the truth, you're going to have to go back to the original documents. You go to the Russell archives. You'll find out what it was really like. But you're not going to find it in the history books. So be cautious when you hear about intellectuals being fighters for justice.
They sort of, when I look around the audience, the sort of rapt attention. I mean, the kids, they're leaning forward in their seats. And it doesn't come from anywhere else.
In 1988, I guess I sort of naively, I knew he was well known, so we put up a simple poster that just said sort of Chomsky, assuming everyone would know who that is, and kind of gave the time and place. We had it in the biggest room that we normally put people in, and we also rented the room next to that so they could have a live audio visual feed. We ended up having it on the same night as the major lecture series for McMaster, the Wooden Lectures. A very famous man came to do that. Despite all that, there was no way people could get into those two rooms. A lot of people were disappointed. They were standing, they were sitting in the aisles, everything else. So there were lots of people that time, but not as many as this time. And it's partly the book 911, it's partly the events of 911, it's partly the fact that things he's been saying for years are becoming more and more obvious to people. And he was prescient, he saw what was happening. And so yeah, his fame was great then, and it's greater now.
What would the demographic mostly have been of people who were getting the tickets?
It was across the board. It was students, it was professionals. We had people from pretty much all walks of life, and people that we hadn't seen before at the store. So it wasn't just regular customers, it was people from all over the city.
Perhaps some of the youthful support for Professor Chomsky is looking for a figurehead, if you like, to focus their own feelings or critiques of many of the issues he's dealing with. I think if that kind of adulation, if you like, is focused on Professor Chomsky specifically, it's something that he would personally be very uncomfortable with and would do his utmost to discourage, given that issues of substance itself that need to be addressed.
It is extremely difficult to keep, especially 9/11. I mean, we've always sold steadily the Chomsky stuff, and I think being close to the university has always helped that. And there is sort of an undercurrent in Hamilton of activism that people don't always see and they're not always aware of. So Chomsky has always sold steadily for us, but 9/11, because it's on so many people's minds, has sold extremely well. I think it is actually officially our best-selling book ever. And considering that it hasn't been available for all that long, I mean, that's extraordinary.
But there is the fact that there is a small percentage of people who come simply because they've heard that it's big. Like someone was telling me the other day, they heard someone saying, "Oh, I hear this guy's Chomsky's coming, so I've got a ticket, and I don't know who's opening for him, but I hear." They thought he was a rock star.
The hardest part is exhaustion for him. I mean, actually, part of the reason that I go is to sort of intervene as when it became sort of a rock star reception and fuss and bother, he really needs a manager to shepherd him around and to turn down adding something else and so on. And the question really was whether to hire a manager. And so the first thought was, well, I had just recently quit working. I mean, I had retired. And to see that I should go, the first trip, which was to South America. And, I'll go along, and I'll see if it works. Maybe it won't be so great for his wife to, but he said, yeah, try it, let's see. So I did, and it worked. In fact, it was very funny. In the Argentina portion of that, they're very laid back in sort of Latin American style. Nothing starts on time, and, it's all. And I would, cut things off at the time and on to the next and so on. And I had the feeling I was interfering all the time and really getting in their way. And I just did it. I mean, it had to be done. And at the end, when they gave their big thank you speech at the final event, and thanked Noam and so on and so forth, I was really amazed that the guy in charge with whom we'd been negotiating the whole time said, and we also want to thank Carol for keeping us on track, and without that discipline we could never have gotten through everything we had planned for this trip. And I was just, the idea that in any sense I won't say he welcomed it, but that in any sense he found it a positive thing for his own purposes. So I thought, well, okay, if that's the way it's going to be viewed, then I guess it's all right.
This is too obvious to mention, but he's obviously a very, very gifted man. He's very smart enough to marry Carol Chomsky, who is a wonderful person. I guess I could equally well say she's smart enough to marry him. They are a real powerhouse.
It's very funny in some of these situations. The last trip, which I did not go on, the schedule said he is to have a half an hour alone in a room with no interruptions. And when he got back, he described how somebody sat there with him the whole time. And several times students knocked on the door to have books signed. And the person who was with him said, come right in, and he signed the book. So I was telling my son afterwards how, look what, I mean, it was clearly written there, and it's supposed to be understood. And Noam said they just don't understand. They just don't understand what it means. So my son Harry said to me on the phone, he said, what is not to understand in alone and no interruptions?
Here, one more. You gotta do one more. You gotta do one for me.
And that's it? And then you're out of
And then I'm gone. That's the guy. That's the
You don't want a book signed?
Thanks a lot.
Okay. See you in a few minutes.